Here's a psychological fact you're not ready to face. The OK Corral was not the most brutal gunfight in Old West history. It became the most famous because it was the most comfortable version of the story. And your brain, just like everyone else's, has been choosing the comfortable version your entire life. What I'm about to show you is the version your brain was never supposed to see. There's a reason Hollywood built an entire mythology around a 30-second shootout in a dusty Arizona town. It's not because it was the most brutal. It's not because it was the most historically significant. It's because it was clean. The heroes were easy to identify. The violence stayed at a comfortable distance. The real stories were messier, more human, and far harder to watch. Today, we go through 5 of them, counting down from 5 to 1. And by the time we reach number 1, you won't be thinking about the Old West anymore. You'll be thinking about yourself. Number 5. Fort Sumner, New Mexico, July 14th, 1881. Past midnight. Billy the Kid, 21 years old, the most wanted man in New Mexico, is awake in a friend's house. He's not thinking about legends. He's not thinking about his reputation. He's hungry. He gets out of bed barefoot, no gun, carrying only a knife, and walks toward the kitchen to find something to eat. That's the entire chain of decisions that ended his life. Pat Garrett was already inside that house, sitting in the dark, waiting. When Billy entered the room, he sensed something wrong. He whispered in Spanish, "¿Quién es? ¿Quién es?" Who is it? Garrett fired twice into the darkness. The first bullet hit Billy the Kid in the chest, above the heart. He was dead in 60 seconds. He never saw the face of the man who killed him. Here's the detail history always skips. Garrett walked outside immediately after and sat on the porch shaking. When his deputies asked what happened, he said, "That was the kid, and I think I got him." He wasn't certain. That image, a man sitting in the dark, shaking, not entirely sure of what he just did, is more honest about what violence actually looks like than anything Hollywood ever showed you. And this is only number 5. But this is where it starts to get worse. Most people stop here, at the comfortable edge of discomfort. That's exactly why they never understand what the Old West actually was. What comes next involves a town, a gang, and 12 minutes that will change the way you watch every heist film you've ever seen. Number 4. Coffeyville, Kansas, October 5th, 1892. The Dalton Gang had a plan that no outlaw in American history had ever attempted: rob 2 banks simultaneously in the same town at the same moment. Bob Dalton believed the sheer audacity of it would paralyze any response. The town was Coffeyville, and Bob Dalton had grown up just a few miles away. That was his first and fatal mistake. 5 men rode in wearing false beards as disguises. They split up and entered both banks at the same time, guns drawn. The robbery was working. What they didn't know was that a dozen townspeople had already recognized them through the disguises. While the Daltons were inside counting money, Coffeyville was quietly arming itself. When the gang walked out carrying their bags, they stepped into a wall of gunfire. In less than 12 minutes, 4 of the 5 gang members were dead in the street. The only survivor, Emmett Dalton, took 23 bullets and somehow lived. He served 14 years in prison, was pardoned, and lived until 1937, long enough to see Hollywood make a movie about the day his gang was massacred. He reportedly watched it and said it got almost everything wrong. A survivor watching the comfortable version of his own destruction and quietly noting the inaccuracies. That is one of the most devastating images in the entire history of the Old West. Number 3. Adobe Walls, Texas Panhandle, June 27th, 1874. Before dawn, 28 men are sleeping. Outside, surrounding them completely in the darkness, over 700 warriors. Comanche, Cheyenne, Kiowa. led by Quanah Parker, the most feared war chief on the southern plains. 700 against 28, 25 to 1. Every man in Adobe walls should have died before sunrise. At 3 in the morning, hours before the attack, a wooden ridgepole in the roof cracked under its own weight and split like a sound of a rifle shot. Every man inside woke up instantly. That single structural failure, a piece of wood breaking in the night, is the only reason 28 men lived to see dawn. The battle lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, a hunter named Billy Dixon ended it with a single shot. A group of warriors had gathered on a distant bluff, far enough away that they believed themselves completely safe. Dixon loaded his rifle, read the wind, and fired. The bullet traveled 1,538 meters. It struck a warrior seated on horseback. The attack ended. The U.S. Army officially measured and documented that distance. It remains one of the longest confirmed combat shots of the 19th century. Almost no one in the world knows this happened, because there's no clean heroic narrative here, no famous name to anchor the story to. History remembers what fits our need for individual heroes. What it forgets is just as important as what it keeps. Here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this list. The stories that became the mythology of the Old West were selected not for accuracy, not for historical weight, but for how easily they could be turned into entertainment. The result was a version of history that functioned more like therapy than truth. And your brain accepted it completely, because that's what brains do. They choose the version that allows them to sleep. What comes next is the version that doesn't. But there's something about the OK Corral that almost no one has the honesty to admit. Not the filmmakers, not the documentaries, not even most history books. And that admission explains why the most famous gunfight in American history only makes it to number 2. Number 2. Tombstone, Arizona, October 26, 1881. Here's the correction every film refuses to make. The gunfight did not happen inside the OK Corral. It happened in a narrow alley beside the corral, approximately 3 meters wide. The two groups were less than 2 meters apart when the shooting started. Not a wide sunlit street, not a dramatic face-off with space to breathe. A confined alley close enough to touch the men you were about to kill. 30 seconds later, 3 men were dead and 3 were wounded. Wyatt Earp, standing closest to the cowboys, was completely untouched. Who fired first? 140 years later, that question has never been officially answered. The 3 men who could have answered it were buried within 48 hours. That unresolved question means the most famous gunfight in American history has no confirmed moral center. There are no proven good sides. There are only dead men and survivors, and a story told by the people who walked out of that alley. Your brain resists this. It needs a clear hero. That need, that psychological requirement for a clean moral narrative, is exactly what Hollywood exploited for a century. Now, 16 years before Tombstone, in a town most people couldn't find on a map, 2 men made a choice that the entire mythology of the Old West was quietly built on top of. If what you've heard so far made you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is the sound of a version of history you were given without your consent being replaced by the version that actually happened. What comes next is not just the most historically significant gunfight on this list. It's the moment where you stop looking at the Old West and start looking at something else entirely. 2 men, a personal grievance, 75 meters of open ground. No armies, no accidents of timing, just 2 people
and a choice that could not be unmade. That's not history. That's a mirror. Number 1. Springfield, Missouri, July 21st, 1865. James Butler Hickok, 27 years old, already called Wild Bill, is broke and spending his evenings playing cards at the Lyons House Hotel. Davis Tutt is also in Springfield. They've known each other for years, served on opposite sides of the Civil War, gambled together, by some accounts competed for the same woman. By the summer of 1865, the friendship has become something with an edge to it. On the night of July 20th, Davis reached across the card table and took Wild Bill's gold pocket watch as collateral for a gambling debt. Wild Bill says, in front of everyone, "Dave, don't you carry that watch across the square tomorrow. If you do, I'll shoot you." Clear, public, and unambiguous. The next morning, Davis Tutt crossed Springfield's town square wearing that watch on his vest, in plain sight.
He wasn't just accepting a challenge. He was saying publicly that Wild Bill's word meant nothing. That Wild Bill was a man who could be humiliated in front of an entire town without consequence. Wild Bill called out from across the square, "Dave, don't you come any closer." Tutt kept walking. At 75 meters apart, unlike any documented pistol confrontation of the era, both men drew simultaneously. Wild Bill braced his right wrist with his left hand to steady his aim. No other gunfighter of the period was documented using that technique. Tutt fired. His bullet passed within inches of Wild Bill. Wild Bill fired once. His bullet hit Davis Tutt directly in the heart. Tutt took a few steps, said, "Boys, I'm killed," and fell dead in the middle of the square. The confrontation lasted less than 2 seconds. The newspaper coverage of Wild Bill's trial spread across America. For the first time, the national press had the story that matched the archetype they were looking for. 2 men, face to face, drawing simultaneously in a public square with witnesses. Every duel you have ever seen on screen comes from that description. Every high noon face-off, every hand hovering over a holster. It all starts here. But here is what stays with you. Davis Tutt knew what was going to happen. Wild Bill had said it out loud in front of witnesses the night before, and Tutt walked across that square anyway. Not because he was reckless, but because backing down, returning the watch, accepting the humiliation, felt worse than the risk of holding on. He chose his pride over his life. How many times have you held on to something, a grievance, a point of pride, a position you knew was wrong, because letting go felt worse than the consequence of holding on? That's not history. That's every human being who has ever lived. Tutt just paid for it in 75 meters of open Missouri ground. 5 gunfights. 5 moments where human beings made choices they could not take back. None of them look the way you were taught. The truth is always messier, more human, and more uncomfortable than the myth. The men who lived these moments were not heroes or villains. They were people, making decisions in real time under pressure most of us will never face. We mythologize them for the same reason Tutt crossed that square, because the truth of what they actually were is harder to carry than the legend, but it's more worth carrying. The myth is comfortable. The history is better.
Subscribe to the American Vault. Turn on the notifications, because in a world of shadows, the only thing more dangerous than the truth is not knowing it at all. See you in the next file.